Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Maisres, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, Daf Beis. We left off on Daf Beis, Amud Aleph Mamish, all the way on top of the Amud. And let's quickly recap the Klal Amru concerning Maisres. As we said, Maisres means Trumais or Maisres, etc. All of the tithings. And that is that for something to be obligated to be tithed, it must have all of the following three criteria, all of the following three qualifications. Number one, it has to be oichel, food edible to human beings. Number two, it has to be nishmar, it has to be protected, which is the topic that we're learning about right now. Protected means that if produce was declared hefker, it does not have to be tithed. And number three, gedulav min haaretz, it has to be something that grows from the ground. And as we mentioned yesterday in the intro, that this is unlike Peah that has these three, plus for Peah it has to be likitasoi ka'achas, and by Peah it has to be machnison likiyum. But we're going to leave that for Peah. Now, when it came to the nishmar, which excludes hefker, we began to learn yesterday what Rav Chizda said, and there are a couple of steps. Step number one is that if produce was even only for one moment hefker, even if it was reacquired, it's going to still remain exempt from trumas. However, says Rav Chizda, that it was declared hefker at a time that one could have designated it as maisres. But if your produce was still mechubar lakarka, it was still connected to the ground, it wasn't yet harvested, even if it was declared hefker, and then it was reacquired all while connected to the ground, that will never be exempt from the chiyuv of maisres, because there was a moment in which it wasn't nishmar, because it was not nishmar, bisman, where there was no chiyuv. In contrast, once it was harvested, not by the meruach, not when you're obligated to tithe it, but when it was in stalks, when it was shibolim, this is a time in which you don't yet have to tithe it, but if you will choose to tithe it, it will be effective. There is where we use the nishmar, that if you declared it ownerless, even for a moment, and then you reacquired it, it's going to remain exempt. I want to add one detail. If it came to the meruach, all while it had an owner, and then after you made the meruach, you declared it ownerless and you reacquired it, you will also not be exempt. In other words, once the chiyuv was chal, you can't remove it. So we limited the criteria of nishmar. This statement, everyone agrees to. Comes along Rab Chinana, b'shem Rab Chizda, that the same is also regarding hegdish. So this is important. So let's speak it out. That means all of the details. If something, while it was attached to the ground, was declared hegdish, then it was redeemed, then it was harvested, it has to be tithed. If something reached the meruach stage, that means before the owner was magdashit, then it has to be tithed. But if something was detached from the ground, it wasn't shibalim, and the owner declared it hegdish, even if the owner then redeemed it, so now it's back under the ownership of a hedyot, it's exempt. Why? Because there was a moment that it was hegdish. And not only is that something that Rabbi Chinana said, but there is a logic behind it. And the logic behind it really was Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai quoting a pasuk in Parshas Re'eh, and just to repeat the pasuk where it says, "Ubaha Levi ki ein loy chelik v'nachla imach." So Rabbi Yanai has these words that what has to be tithed, right? Mima sheyesh lecha ve'ein loy, which is normal produce. Ein loy meaning that he doesn't have a nachla. From there at chayv litan loy. Mashe ein kein, when it comes, let's say, to hefker. Hefker is equally owned by all, so there's no chiyuv maisres. And by the way, the same is by hegdish. Hegdish is equally equally prohibited on you and on the Levi because it belongs to God. So therefore, it makes sense to apply the same rule of hefker to hegdish. The Gemara began to point out, and that's where we left off, that implied from a question that the Chabura, which is one of the many names we give to the Chachamim during that time, they had a question on the limud of Rabbi Yanai. From their question, we understand that they argue with this second part of Rav Chizda. We argue with Rav Chinana b'shem Rav Chizda. We don't hold that hegdish is like hefker. What does the Chabura yes hold? They hold that if someone owned produce, even though it's now in Shibolim, and they were magdish it. Now, of course, when it belongs to hegdish, it's not going to be tithe. But if the owner or someone else redeems it, now that it's redeemed before the Meruach, it will be obligated to be tithed. In other words, the exemption that we give to hefker, according to the Chachamim, according to the Chabura, is not the same that we give to hefker. It doesn't mean that the Chabura disagree with the limud of Rabbi Yanai, that what mimashi yesh lecha ve'eloi at chayiv litinoi. The Gemara will explain that even when something is hegdish, we can't say that everyone disowns it equally. There is still a difference between you and the Levi, as we'll point out, which will be the rationale behind the Chachamim. Now, we're going to add another detail about Nishmad. I mean, the whole discussion here of Nishmad is that you declared the produce ownerless when it wasn't Shibalim. What's going to happen if a person is going to sow land that's ownerless? How will that fit into the Nishmar? That will be some of the discussion today. And from there, the Gemara today on Daf Beis will move on to the final, to the third criteria of Gedul of Min Haaretz. And after expounding that, some details, we're going to go into the end of the Mishnah. The Mishnah gave a Oid Klal Acher Amru, if you remember, and we're going to dive into that. There is a implied understanding from our Mishnah that if something is not grown for food, if something is being grown for its seed, for that product to be replanted, not to be eaten, so then it's not included in the obligation of Mises, which is correct. There is going to be a discussion whether this implied limud, and the Gemara is going to give examples of certain scenarios where something is left on the ground, not for its food, yes, for its seed, whether l'kula alma, that will be exempt from Mises, or whether that's going to be subject to a machlekes between our Mishnah that will hold it's exempt versus the Rabban Gamliel that will hold that it's chayiv. That will be Daf Beis, and let's dive right inside. So again, you remember the whole hemshech. So we have Rab Chizda by Hefker, we have Rab Chinana b'shem Rab Chizda Hegdish, and now we're going to show you how the Chachamim argue with this Afla Hegdish. We will not. The Chachamim don't agree that Hegdish is like Hefker, but the way we built up to it is that we quoted the limud of Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai learns the whole concept that only mimashi yesh lecha ve'ein loy at chayiv to give maisres. Okay, which is why we exclude Hefker. Now, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, I want you to know that Chabura hayamakshem, regarding this limud that we just mentioned, mimasha at chayiv, mimashi yesh lecha ve'ein loy at chayiv litin. Rabbi Yechanan said that the Chabura had a question, which is that l'chu'ura, that should have applied to Hegdish, which, by the way, that's exactly what Rabbi Chizda holds. But evidently, the Chabura don't agree with Rabbi Chizda. And they ask themselves, why not? It should have applied to Hegdish. Hadei Hegdish, l'chu'ura, hadei ein yodcha v'yodei shavin. The owner, any person, a Yisrael and a Levi, have equal rights. Now, it's ironic. By Hefker, equal rights means everyone has the right to acquire Hefker. Everyone has the right to it, so they're equal. By Hegdish, it's in the opposite direction. No one has the right to use Hegdish, but it's also equal. That's the pshat. Ein yodcha v'yodoi shavin. It's the prohibition of you or the Levi making use of Hegdish is equally prohibited. Just like by Hefker, k'moshe yodcha v'yodoi shavin. And now you see, so what's the kasha? According to Rab Chinana, exactly. The kasha, now you see implied in what the Chabura was asking, you see that the Chabura hold that Hegdish does not abide by the same rule. That if a person is Magdish Shibalim and then they redeem it, they are obligated to be Ma'aseret. They are obligated. The only question is, Taka, why would you be obligated? Now, Amar Rabbi, just to limit exactly where is the Chachamim and Rab Chizda arguing, in which scenario? Man nan chayim. This is important. If someone was either mafkir, their produce, or they were magdish it, and prior to it being reacquired or prior to it being redeemed, the pile was smooth. That produce came to its gemar malacha. So I want you to know, this is what we said yesterday, what we repeated today, that if during the time of Miruah something is exempt, it's always going to remain exempt. And that's based on the Torah. And now we're quoting a pasuk in Pasha Shoiftim God. Again, you can look in the Torah, Oir HaShalom, the pasuk is Reishis Digoncha Tiroshcha V'Yitzarecha. And the Reishis Geisoincha Titen Loi to the Kohen. And by the way, it's not only to the Kohen, the Trumas to the Kohen, but then you have to take off the Maisris. So what do we learn from the words Digoncha? Your pile. First of all, I want you to know, guys, that digun is a word that's used when the produce is smoothed. Even though dagan is rightfully translated as grain, but specifically it's referring to grain that is in its gemar malacha state. Digun and meruach are the same. And the gancha, your digun, that means when you make the meruach, it must belong to you. That is when you're obligated. And taka, from there we learn, reishis digancha v'lo shel hefker. If during the meruach it's not yours, or if during the meruach it belongs to hegdish, v'lo shel hegdish, no one will hold you obligated. So first of all, just to clarify, even though you redeemed it later, even though you acquired it later, elakim nan kaimen, where are we having this discussion? Where Rav Chinana b'shem Rav Chizda says one, and the Chachamim say the opposite, is like this. By hefker, everyone agrees. B'shehifker b'shibal. And b'chazet b'zacha b'hem. Don't forget, the Gemara doesn't have to repeat what we learned at the end of Daf Aleph Amid Beis, that if you were mafked it while it's still mechuber lekarka, and then you reacquired it, that's also not going to do anything. So it's when it's in shibal. And here, indeed, according to the Chachamim, behefker potter and behekdesh chayiv. Okay, now, you ask a question based on a premise. The Gemara wants to know, why did they even think that? Why are you thinking not like Rab Chizda, and you're asking a question? Adarabba, who told you that? Why don't you just go with the premise like Rab Chinana b'shem Rab Chizda, that hegdish is like hefker? And indeed, based on the limud of Rabbi Yanai, that mimashi yesh lecha ve'ein loy at chayv litaloi. Hegdish ein lecha ve'ein loy. You're equal. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you from where we know it actually from a Mishnah. And the Gemara's inference from the Mishnah is so stark that everyone will have to explain how did Rab Chizda even go otherwise. Okay, so behefker zakt the Gemara. How do we know that by hefker indeed? If you were mafked it while it wasn't shibalim, even though you right away reacquired it b'shibalim, you are taka exempt. Indeed, we learn it because we accept the limud mima minahid amar Rabbi Yechon b'shem Rabbi Yanai. This is the pasuk of Bo Halevi Pashas Re'ei ke'ein lechelik v'nach le'imach. From there we learn mimashi yesh lecha ve'ein loy ad chayv litaloi, and that taka excludes that if something is hefker while it's b'shibalim, since during that time everyone has equal access. Sheyotcha v'yodei shavan boy. Okay, so clear. So that's clear. Now, what about hegdish? Again, Rab Chinana taka says that's from where we know hegdish. But the Chabura, obviously, they asked because they disagreed with it. Based on what? Says the Gemara Mishnah, the hegdish chayiv, even though it was a moment mugdash while it was b'shibalim, since you redeemed it prior to the meruach, you will be chayiv min hadah. Now, what's beautiful in the Yerushalmi, now that we are already many mesachtas into it, we're not going to have this in the Bavli. The Bavli would quote the part of the Mishnah from where the Chabura has a proof. The Yerushalmi doesn't do that. The Yerushalmi quotes the first line of the Mishnah, which is Higdish Kama Upada Kama Chayev. Obviously, this doesn't prove anything. We already said yesterday that if something was still attached prior to the harvest, it being mukdash and it being redeemed doesn't do anything. That has nothing to do with our conversation. And anachanami. So what the Marafulda brings the Seifa of the Mishnah. Now the Seifa of the Mishnah has many parts. There's the Seifa, which is also not, the next line in the Mishnah is also not the proof. But the final part of the Mishnah will be the proof. So keep your finger in the Gemara. And guys, we're going to around 5 lines before the end of the narrow lines in the Marafulda. The last Marafulda in the narrow lines. So you read this, what's that ayah? We're talking about Shibalim, we're not talking about Kama. And Achanami. So says the Marabi, Seifa Maisa. The proof of the Gemara is from the same. So let's read the Mishnah. Higdish Oymarim means you already harvested it. It's already bundled. Higdish Oymarim, Upada Oymarim. The Mishnah says clearly, befedish, that you are chayev. That's quite amazing. Now let me tell you what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says that if grain was mukdash while standing, and then you redeemed it, and then you made them into oymarim, you're going to be chayiv. The Mishnah says, listen to this, that if you're magdish it, hegdish, when it's standing, and then you harvest it, and after the harvest, you redeem it. Another thing, the Mishnah says you're going to be potter. Amazing. Why? Because, my friends, the critical point, first of all, I want to make something clear. I'm sorry. All that we are reading right now is peya. The critical point by peya, this is going back to Masechtas Peya, is when you reap. If you remember, when you begin to reap the field, that is machayev peya. Very much like the meruach is machayev. So the first thing you need to know is that everything we're learning over here is just about peya. So what are we talking about? We're not talking about peya. We're talking about the maisres. So you have to continue to read from the Mishnah. The Mishnah continues to read. This is, by the way, but this is in the 4th chapter in Masechtas Maisres, halacha. Hey, the 5th Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if you consecrate, if you're magdish, oymarim, before the meruach, the Mishnah says, and then you redeem it after the meruach. That means that during the meruach it was consecrated. The Mishnah says potter. Now, what does that imply? Why are you exempt? You were exempt because during the meruach it was mukdash, which would mean that if you consecrate it before the meruach and you redeem it before the meruach, yes, you're going to be chayiv, which is quite amazing. And by the way, that inference is so strong that really this Mishnah poses a huge question against the Rabbi that we're not going to get into right now. But again, the fact that the Mishnah writes, that's the proof. The Mishnah writes by Maisnes, that if you're magdish it before the meruach, and then you redeem it after the meruach, you're exempt. Because during the meruach, it belonged to hegdish, which implies that if you're magdish it before the meruach and you redeem it before the meruach, which is exactly our topic, then you will be chayiv. So first of all, that's a proof to the Chachamim, not like Rab Chinana b'shem Rab Chizna. And now we understand. Now we have to answer the question: why indeed is it so? Why don't we use the limud of the Rabbi Yanai that mimashi yesh l'cha ve'elo yad chai?
Quick question. I'm sorry. Doesn't matter your thought process in this, what you had in mind when you're doing all this?
No, it doesn't matter what you had in mind. Here it matters at what, there's a critical point. If at the critical point by Hegdish, according to the Mishnah, only if it was Mugdash during the Meruach is it exempt. Now, indeed, Ma Bein Hefker, Ma Bein Hegdish. So the Gemara gives 2 approaches. This is not according to Rab Chizda, not according to Rab Chinana b'shem Rab Chizda, but this is according to the Chabur. Number 1, Hefker Yotza Yidei HaKoil. This is very important. In other words, during the time, my friend, that something is Hefker, no one has any ownership. No one has ownership, which means everyone is equal. they don't own it, and they could own it. Masha'enken by Hegdish. Masha'enken by Hegdish. Now listen to this logic. The Gizbar has some type of ownership in it. Now I know that Gizbar is not the original owner. It doesn't matter. But it's not the Yad HaKoil Shavin. Actually, there is a Machlokes Tanoim whether the Gizbar, if the Gizbar decided to separate Maisris, while it belonged to Hegdish, if the Gizbar separated, there's a Machlokes Tanoim, some hold it's even effective.
Hey, Rabbi, in that vein, can you just explain in general what it means that grain that is Hegdish would be subject to Maisris? How does that work?
Well, there's an obligation, and then there is
who's the obligation on the Beis Hamikdash?
On the Beis Hamikdash, Danny. Now, well, no one is saying there's an obligation, but there are some Tanoim hold that if the Gizbar separated Maisres, his separation is valid. You know, you're going to have two Kedushas. You're going to have the Kedusha of Truma and the Kedusha of Hegdish. And if you remember, we learned in Masechta Truma is such cases, not this way, but it's Shayach for a Kohen to take his Truma and to be Magdashit. Something could have double Kedusha. Coming back over here, Hefker belongs to no one. Since one approach will be is that when you're Magdash something, there is a differentiation in ownership. The Gizbar has some Balabatishkeit. The Gabbai has some Balabatishkeit in the shul more than the other people. Now Danny understands. So that's it. It's not equal. Hegdish lo yotze yedei Gizbar. Now, it's not a perfect answer because other Tanoim hold that the Gizbar cannot separate Maisris. It would be ineffective. So there's another answer. Amar Rabbi Oven, this is even a better answer. Let me just say this by heart, my friends. When you consecrate something to the Berek Habayis, don't forget the Beis Hamikdash wants cash. Right? They want cash. I mean, obviously, items that will be used themselves in the Avodah, even better. But when a guy gives the Beis Hamikdash his field, the Beis Hamikdash doesn't need the field, so they're going to sell it. I want you to know that there is a law that the original owner is given the right to the first bid. Happens also to be that when the original owner redeems it, he adds more money without getting into that. The fact that the original owner has the right to the first bid means that he is still epes abalabaster. If everyone's ownership would have been equal, then why would the original owner have the right to the first bid? Now, unlike Hefker, guys, if I'm mafker something, I don't have the right to the first reacquisition. And when I'm after it, everyone has equal ownership. That's a Gavaldic answer.
But you're closest, but you're physically closest to it. You have credit, you're there.
Very correct, Haven. But legally, I don't stand before anyone else. And the fact that if I consecrate, I do. You can't say that it's fully left the ownership of the original owner. Why? Since this is the law. When the Beis Hamikdash is going to be selling it, they have to go to the original owner and they have to give him the first bid. Pidei Rishon. So that's why, actually, it's not that Mimashi Yesh L'cha Ve'ein Loi. It's still Mimashi Yesh L'cha Ve'ein Loi. You can say that. Beautiful. Chevra Daf Beis Amud Beis. Now, Atkan was about someone who declared his shibalim ownerless. All right, he became exempt. Now we're going to apply the din of nishmat in a little bit of a different scenario. Like I mentioned, if you have a field that was already declared ownerless, comes along someone and he plants produce in that field, what will be the status of that produce? So says the Gemara Rab Ze'era and Rabbi Yasa b'shem Rabbi Lazar Hazarei Yasadei Hefker. If you sow a field that the land itself is Hefker, listen to this, you are still chayiv b'maisres. Why are you chayiv b'maisres? Just like we learned yesterday, that if someone owns a field, but prior to the harvest they declared the field and the standing grain ownerless, since you can't be ma'asir when something is still connected to the ground, so therefore it will never be exempted by the fact that it was hefker. Same thing over here. It's the same, even though it's not the same. However, Rabbi Yoina, mapik lishna b'zachac b'stei hefker v'gidu leha. What he wanted to make it clear is that the above ruling in which Rabbi Zeira and Rabbi Yassi say you're chayiv, just to make it clear, you know when you're chayiv? You're chayiv when someone acquired, the main thing is the produce prior to its harvest. Don't forget that everyone will agree that when some produce was harvested, if at that moment it's hefker, no one is debating with the Mishnah, then it's not nishmar. Even only for one moment, it will be exempt. Where do we say that even though the field was ownerless, nevertheless, the one who planted the produce will be chayiv b'maisres? That's only if the person who planted it acquired it. Now, how do you acquire attached produce? I'll tell you how, by acquiring the field. If a field is ownerless, how would you make a kinyan on the produce? That's why he's saying over here, Zajac b'sdei hefker, that someone needed to acquire it, the field and the produce prior to the harvest, then you're talking going to be chayiv. Beautiful. So everything fits with what we learned yesterday.
Oh, you're planting in an ownerless field. Aren't you the owner?
Not if your intent is important. Not if you didn't make a kinyan. And by the way, part of making a kinyan, Kevan, is your intention. Right. But the kinyan has the gemiras das that's expressed through an action of a kinyan, clearly by a kinyan. If a man has no intention of acquiring, even if while he's sleepwalking through life, if he does the act of a kinyan, doesn't do anything. Okay. The third criteria in the Mishnah was Gedul of Mina'aretz. So let's go on that. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Chia bar Ada asked in front of the great Rabbi Yechanan, Kemeyinu Pitriyos, right, which is what we learned in the Marafulda. This is really what the Mishnah is excluding. What about truffles and mushrooms? What is their lore? He asked, should they be chayiv and maisres or not? So Amalei, Rabbi Yechanan, B'Shem Rabbi Sisai. It's amazing that we're going back to the Aser Ta'aser. Ksiv Aser Ta'aser Eis Kol Tfua Zarecha. From there we learn something that you plant or it needs to be planted for it to sprout. That is something that is obligated in maisres. That comes also to exclude yatsu kamenu pitriyos, truffles and mushrooms. She'enam nizrois umatzmichos. How great is that? They don't grow as a result of being planted, right? V'haraya, when the conditions are right, they grow spontaneously. That's the meaning of it. And that's unique. So that's one way. Since when the conditions are right, they grow spontaneously, it doesn't need zriya. That is what exempts truffles and mushrooms. That's one limud. Or Rabbi Yoina Mapik, Lishna, he used a different expression. He understands it differently. That even though they are coming out of the ground, but they're not getting their sustenance primarily from the ground. It's a whole different. It's not about whether they need to be planted or not. It's about from where it draws its sustenance. And truffles and mushrooms primarily draw their sustenance from the air. And other zerayim primarily draw their sustenance from the earth itself.
Could you say that an nafkamina would be that if you have mushrooms, which are actually cultivated by humans, like, you have mushroom farms, according to one opinion, that would be chayiv in maisres, whereas, let's say, the wild truffles that just come on their own would not be.
I don't know.
According to the second
maybe, I hear what you're saying. Maybe even according to the first, the fact that they are able to grow spontaneously is enough to exclude them from the obligation, even if they were planted.
Oh, wait.
It's not something that needs to be planted. Or it's not about the act of needing of planting or not. Actually, I just want you to know that Rabbi Yoina does not learn it from Eis Kol Tfua Zarecha. The Marafulda here says that the second Lishna learns it from a pasuk we quoted yesterday, Mizera Ha'aretz. Mizera Ha'aretz. Okay, let's go back.
Forgive me that way. When we did peah, stuff that grew simultaneously out of thin air, were they subject to laws of peah?
One more time.
Okay, anything that grows on its own, out of nowhere, were those subject to the laws of peah?
No, they're not. Because by peah, if I remember correctly, the three that we have here are the same that we have in peah. Gedul of min haaretz. It's not
right.
gedul of min. In Peah, we added 2 more criteria, right? Machnisam lekiyum and likitose ka'achas that excluded the figs. Okay, let's go back over here. Then the Mishnah said, what were the words in the Mishnah? That oit klal achar amru, right? That kol. I'm just reading the words of the Mishnah. Kol shetchilasi oichel v'soifa oichel. As we mentioned, that even though people normally want it to grow for it to become larger, but it's oichel, it's edible even when it's little. There is where the Mishnah says that even if someone harvested it before the norm, you'll be chayiv in maises. Afal pishu shoymroi, or something that's tchilasi oifel v'soifa oichel. Afal pishu shoymroi lohoisiv oichel. Even if people normally leave it in the ground, why? So there should be more food stuff. So then the din is you'll be chayiv even if it was katoin, for sure if it's godly. Okay. Masha enkein, something that is not oichel when it begins to grow, which is fruits before them reaching oinas hamaises, which is grain before them reaching a third. Before that, they're not edible. If someone harvested them before they reach that third, you won't be chayiv in maises. That's the mission. But now we're being medayik, we're making an inference. And now again, we're going to see whether this inference is according to all or whether this inference is all machloikes. So again, the words of the Mishnah is, as you can read it, that's when you're chayiv, even though you harvested it when it's a cut. Infers the Gemara, but if something is edible, this is important. But why do people leave it in the ground? So there are certain items that you only leave it in the ground because the longer it stays connected to the ground, the more seeds will grow. It's edible now. But normally people are shoymroi here means you don't harvest it. You guard it in the ground. If you're shoymed it, not lohoisev oichel, but yes, lohoisev zera, certain things, pasha, the food part of it doesn't become more voluminous, if that's the word. It doesn't grow. The seeds grow, then it's amazing. That item, this is very powerful, won't be obligated in maises. And furthermore, I'll go furthermore, if something lechatchila was planted only for zera, now is this subjective, is this objective? We'll get into this. If something is planted primarily for its seed, and it's not an edible seed, it's a seed that's used to plant, that item is excluded from the Torah, from the obligations of maises. Based on this inference, says the Gemara, says Rav Imi, b'shem Lakish. You're saying good, but you should know that and he's quoting a Talmud Rav Gamliel that we actually have in the 4th chapter here in Masechtas Maises. The Taninan Tamon, we're going to learn later in this Masechta. Now, what's the example that Rav Gamliel is talking about? Rav Gamliel Leiman. Tomorrow shall tilson or chardel or pul halavin. We're speaking about plants that when they begin to grow, they sprout. I don't see it from the Kavon's picture. I see a flower. But what we're talking about are plants that they sprout a date light bud. They sprout a date, a little date. And I want you to know that those dates, those little buds are edible. People eat them. Now, people don't plant them to harvest the little buds to eat them. You know, it's oichel, but it's not planted to eat it. It's planted, all of these items, chardel, it's planted for its seeds. Rabbi Gamliel says that since when they grow, they go through this phase of having tomatoes, to have these little buds that are edible, they are chayv and maises, even though they are planted, very good. And more important, they are nishmar. Why do people guard them? Why do people leave them in the ground? They're shoymroi, not lohoisev oichel. They're shoymroi lohoisev zera. Nevertheless, Rabbi Gamliel is of the opinion that since what you have is edible, it's amazing. Then it's obligated. then it's obligated. So that, it says Rav Imi, okay, so our Mishnah, the Chachamim, which imply that only if it's lohoisev oichel are you chai. If it's lohoisev zera, you're pater, even though now it's edible, that the Chachamim would agree with Rabbi Gamliel. And they would hold that tomorrows, that the tilson and the chavdal and pul halavan are not going to be chayiv, to be kai. However, Amar Rabbi Yosi, I argue with you, Rav Imi. You misunderstood Rabbi Gamliel. If the reason why Rabbi Gamliel is holding when it comes to these tomorrows of tilson, etc., the reason why he says Yechayiv is because people can eat them, that does not fit. Because these plants also have green parts, they have leaves. And I want you to know that these leaves are edible. People eat those leaves. Come to LA, you have no idea what people eat. And nevertheless, Rabbi Gamliel in the Mishnah only obligates for you to tie the buds. This is very important. Okay. Ella, so the question is Ella. Rabbi Gamliel loimer, chashuvois hein lo'oichel. It's a unique din. In other words, what Rav Yosi is saying is that the inference from our Mishnah is l'kula alma, which means, guys, let me just speak this out. Everyone agrees that if a plant is grown for its seeds, that's the purpose, we will not consider any part of it food. Okay?
Not even the seeds.
Correct. None of it. Not even the edible part. The Rav Gamliel's Mishnah and Perek Daled is unique by the fenugreek and the other items that he mentions, even though he agrees that most people primarily grow them, or halachically we view those plants to be primarily grown for their seeds. Nevertheless, he holds that their buds is unique. There's some type of chashivus in their buds that they are considered food on their own right. Leaves are not considered food in their own right. So it's not about whether people eat them, it's about halachically, is there any type of chashivus oichel? So there's something unique about it. And the Rabbanan Amri, regarding the seeds of fenugreek, that they are not considered lo'oichel in their own right. Look inside the Maharafulda, guys, 3 lines under the Gemara. How can you, Rabbi, think if it's just because people eat them? Oichel means not because it's objectively considered food, but because people eat them. If that would be the reason in Cain, we learned good that that's the way he learns the Gemara. Would that Rav Gamliel should have said you have to tie them. The Yarkon my time hoyel v'zoreya lezera. Since the purpose, the intent, guys, we're learning the big klolim in Maisis. If the intention of the farmers who plant these items primarily plant them lezera, so then loy chashuva is oichel. Then we're not going to give its leaves the chashivos of food because that was not the intention of the planter. There's something unique about exceptions. Avol tomorrow's, which is not a leaf, it's already something substantial, right? It's a bud. Hein lo oichel, the chashuvas hein lo oichel, according to Rabbi Gamliel, even though you did not plant it to eat it. After Zadon Lezera. In Cain, what do we infer from here? Sha'are Zireinam Nami, Ki Zadon Lezera, Loi Chashuvas Oichel, After Rabbi Gamliel, which would mean that our Mishnah, that's what we're getting to, our Mishnah is L'Kula Alma. Our Mishnah is not against Rabbi Gamliel, because the diok of our Mishnah was that if you're shoymroi lo oichel, then you're chayiv. If you're shoymroi lezera, then you are exempt. Agrees Rabbi Gamliel. Umasnisim divrei hakoli. Beautiful. Very good. Okay. Now, let's hop another few lines. We have time. I want to prove the same from another brayso. Instead of making our Mishnah subject to our machlokes tanoim, now everyone agrees with the inference of our Mishnah that the intent of the owner is significant. And if someone leaves a product in the ground, or better, if you plant a product in the ground primarily for its seed, you'll be exempt. You'll be exempt. However, Tilson is unique. From what I said, the Tani guys, Daf Gimel Amad Aleph, Amar Rabbi Yeshua, Miyomai loy milo ani libi loy merlo adam. I never allowed myself to tell a person, say ulakoit lecha tomari shel tilson v'shel chardoi v'shel pul halavain, right, and cook them without separating tithes. I would never say that. Lepatroi min hamaisros. I never. Rabbi Yeshua was choishes to Rabbi Gamliel that when it comes to the tilson and chadil and pul halavan, there is a unique chashivus to the tamaros, even though your intention is lezera. Look inside the second, the maraful, the second from the top. That I never told a person, all you need to do is gather these buds and you're good. Why is that? Why did he not tell it to a person? Because for this, Rabbi Gamliel argues. Now, the lav hachi, if it's not a unique chashash by the tilson chadl and polalovin, it's tamarais. But my hayim mistapik. If the doubt is concerning the din of our Mishnah, the inference of our Mishnah, Vadai Rabbi Yeshua will paskin like our Mishnah. That our Mishnah is telling you that only when you're shomer something, or even Vadai, only when you plant something le'oichel, are you going to be chayv in maisvus. Which means that if you plant something lezera, or even more, if something is left to develop more in the ground, not because the food itself will grow, but because the seeds will grow, our Mishnah is implying that will be exempt. And therefore, since Vadai Rabbi Yeshua will paskin like our Mishnah, it must be that the tilson, chadal, and polalovin is a unique exception, which is why there, even though he paskins like our Mishnah, he was chayish l'shitas Rabbi Gamliel. Elavadai bechashuvais. If you plant something lezera, you're potter, and Rabbi Yeshua agrees with that. The only thing is that the tamaros of the tilson, chadal, and polalovin, when it's very little, they are edible, to the point that they might be viewed as objective food regardless of the intent. And that is taking the machlokes Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim. So since Rabbi Gamliel had a doubt, Rabbi Yeshua had a doubt, Ike Rabbi Gamliel, Ike Rabbanan, the mistapikle. So therefore he said, amazing, even though it's Rabbi Gamliel and the Rabbanan, again, you would go halachic kerabim, but he understood, he felt that Rabbi Gamliel is onto something, but it's unique. And the din of our Mishnah, so now the rule is that if something is left in the ground because you want it to have more seeds, that means it's being shoimed, lezera, not shoimed, lo'oichel, it will be exempt, which is amazing. We'll just stop with that, because when we began the Mishnah, the klal, we learned three different criteria. Oichel, nishmar, gedulav min haaretz. We're putting the oichel and the nishmar together. I know that the pshat of nishmar is lafuke hefket. We learned good. That was the whole thing today and yesterday. But now we're adding another nuance, another knech, that the nishmar le'oichel. Even if something is nishmar, but if the nishmar is not le'oichel, then it's going to be exempt from Isis. Gavaldik. And we'll stop over here, and God willing, to be continued.
Shkoyach.
My guys, have a great day.
You too, Rabbi. Thank you.
Tomorrow on Zoom, and Friday, God willing, in person.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Didn't we learn in one of these other Masechtas that there's I don't remember which item it was, where the intent of the individual would determine if the leaves are something that would be subject to maasros or not?
Could be, Danny.
Remember?
But let me tell you,
it's normally done for the seeds, but if you use the leaves and you're intending to use that as food.
Masechta Shabbos, who knows Masechta Shabbos? My son, Rabbi Mendel, knows Masechta Shabbos good. So that was the whole thing about. I remember about the shiurim to be chayv and hoitzah, that I remember. That even though normally the shiur of hoitzah by food is gregeres, but if someone is saving the seeds, right, or someone is putting it away to plant, then the shiur that's machayiv chatos or God forbid skila is a smaller shiur. That's the opening of a pedic, I think. It could be you meant something else, Danny, but you're right. The intention, many times, I mean, this is a big issue. How much does your intent affect? And how much do we say that the batla daita? All right.